The Great Trouble by Deborah Hopkinson. Part 2, The Blue Death. The most terrible outbreak of cholera which ever occurred in this kingdom is probably that which took place in Broad Street, Golden Square. Dr. John Snow. On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, 1855. The people stood by one another in this season of peril and perplexity with unflinching and admirable courage. Reverend Henry Whitehead. The Cholera in Berwick Street, 1854. Chapter 9. The First Coffin. Later that morning I was back on Broad Street, looking up at Mr. Griggs' window. I'd already walked miles. I rubbed a crick in my neck. I felt stiff from spending the night outside. No use complaining, I reminded myself. I was still a bit hungry, even though Mrs. Miggle, in honor of my special day, had given me 2 fresh biscuits to stick in my pockets when I left. I'd stopped at the Warwick Street pump to wash the rest of the mud off my legs. I doused my head, too, and had a good drink of water. I was about to go upstairs to see Mr. Griggs when Dilly came trotting around the corner and rushed right at me, putting her paws up on my chest and whining softly. "Where have you come from, then?" I asked, scratching the soft spot behind her silky ears. I looked up, half expecting to see Mr. Griggs himself strolling down Broad Street. Dilly often tagged along with him when he made deliveries to his best customers. There was no Mr. Griggs in sight. What would happen to the dog, to the whole family, if he didn't recover? Mrs. Griggs wouldn't be able to keep the shop, I knew that. Things would be hard. I thought of what Mom had told Henry and me after Pa died. It's no small thing to lose a father. The world is a cruel place for fatherless children. But even she had no idea how cruel. I thought Mr. Dickens had named his last book well, Hard Times. In front of me, the tailor shop was closed and dark. No sounds came from the room above. I should go in, I knew. Instead, I stood there, talking nonsense to a dog. "Well, if I still had my situation at the line, I'd take you with me on an errand this fine day," I told her. "But my destination is right here, to check on your master, Mr. Griggs." Still, I didn't move. I stood squinting in the thick, oily sunlight. I wiped sweat from my forehead. "I don't want to go in there," I thought suddenly. "I can't do it." "Eel!" It was Florrie. She and Betsy hurried toward me with the Reverend Henry Whitehead behind them. Everyone who lived near the Golden Square knew the young assistant curate at St. Luke's. The Reverend was a tall man, bright and curious as a robin. When we'd first met and he'd asked if I could read, he'd told me, "Schooling is important. I was lucky in that regard, lad. I grew up by the seaside in a town called Ramsgate. My father was headmaster of Chatham House, and I was able to attend because I was his son. It was a better school than we could have ever afforded. That's how I got the chance to go to Oxford." I thought it strange that such an educated man would bother to talk to me. But that was Reverend Whitehead. He knew everyone in the neighborhood and greeted young and old with the same friendly smile, whether they turned up in St. Luke's for Sunday service or not. And mostly, I did not. My heart sank as I looked at his grim face. It wasn't hard to guess that Mrs. Griggs had sent for him. The Reverend said softly, "I'm afraid we have a sad errand at Betsy's house." "I was here yesterday afternoon and looked in on Mr. Griggs then," I said. "Has there been a change?" "Why don't you come along, Eel?" he suggested, not answering me directly. "You and Florrie can stay in the shop with the children while I have a word with their mother." Then he leaned over and put a hand on my shoulder. His voice was low but calm. "I fear the worst." Despite the heat, a shiver ran over my skin. "I want to see my Pa," Betsy piped up. "Don't make me stay downstairs in the shop. I don't like it there without Pa." Florrie and I glanced at Reverend Whitehead, who nodded. "It may bring him comfort." At the top of the stairs, the Reverend knocked and pushed the door open. At first, everything appeared to be much the same as the day before. Then I looked closer and swallowed, trying to keep from crying out, or worse, losing the breakfast Mrs. Miggle had given me. It was hard to tell that Mr. Griggs was alive. His eyes had shrunk in his face, which now seemed as pinched and dried as that of an elderly man. His poor body was no more than an old gray rag that had been wrung out to dry, or the light, papery carcass of a bird left to crackle in the sun. Worst of all, his lips were a dark blue. Suddenly, I understood. This is why they call cholera the Blue Death. He'd lost so much liquid from the inside that his skin and lips were no longer pink and healthy, but blue and dried out. Mrs. Griggs turned to nod at Reverend Whitehead. then put her fingers gently on her husband's wrist. The Reverend stepped forward and knelt beside Mr. Griggs. Bernie lay huddled in the corner, sucking his thumb, his eyes wide. He looked too scared to cry. "Come and say your goodbye now, Betsy," Mrs. Griggs said softly. Betsy hung back, her bony shoulders quivering under her thin dress. Beside me, Florrie had started to shiver too, even though the room was stifling hot. "Take my hand, Betsy," I whispered. "I know exactly what this is like," I thought. "Go ahead, dear girl," Reverend Whitehead encouraged her. "Kiss your father's forehead and whisper in his ear. He can still hear your voice." I watched Betsy put her small hand on her father's shoulder, careful-like, as if she were afraid to cause him more pain. She was a brave girl, Betsy. Her hand didn't tremble. But if Mr. Griggs did catch his daughter's whisper, it was the last sound he heard. We stood without saying anything for a long time. I can't exactly explain it, but I remembered feeling this way before when my father died. It was as if the moment was bigger than any of us. It was like death had tiptoed in among us, freezing us in our places until he'd done his work and left. And what death did was solemn and awful. I remember my mother telling Henry and me, "Don't worry about touching your pa. He can't feel any pain now." Not long after, two men with bored blank faces had come knocking at our door. I remembered those men, stumbling up the stairs, making jokes about dropping the corpse. They had stopped talking when they reached the top, for I was there standing at the door, waiting and watching them. "Sorry, lad," one whispered, as I stepped aside to let them go by. Bernie began to cry. He ran to his mom, who let out a hoarse, exhausted sob. Reverend Whitehead pulled the sheet over the tailor's face. He nodded to Florrie and me. "Maybe the little ones would like a bit of air while I speak with their mum." Florrie got Bernie to his feet. I took Betsy's hand again. "Dilly's downstairs. We'd better go see her before she gets into some sort of trouble." Outside, I found a piece of rope and threw it for Dilly to chase. Betsy and Bernie watched, looking dazed. Annie Lewis came down to fill a bucket at the Broad Street pump. She stared at Betsy and Bernie, then came to me and tugged on my shirt. "Is Mr. Griggs dead, Eel? My mom told me he was awful sick." "Yes, Annie Ribbons, I'm afraid so. Can you come and be with Betsy later? I'm sure she'd like to have you near." Annie bit her lip and shook her head. "Mum needs me." Then she went back inside without another word. After a while, Reverend Whitehead came out, rubbing a clean white handkerchief across his forehead. "Take Bernie to your mother now, Betsy," he told her gently. "She'll find your company a comfort." He looked up and down Broad Street and sighed deeply. From where we stood, we could see people going in and out of shops or heading to the pump with buckets to fill. A man called out in a cheerful voice, "Good day to you, Reverend Whitehead. Have you ever seen anything to beat the likes of this heat?" The Reverend answered him pleasantly, but when the man had gone, he turned to us. "Ah, children, it breaks my heart to see this bustling street now. Before long it will be full of nothing but coffin carts." "It's truly the Blue Death?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes, the symptoms leave no doubt of it." "Maybe Mr. Griggs will be the only one," Florrie said hopefully. "I'm afraid not, my dear." Reverend Whitehead shook his head. "I've already received word that others were taken ill last night." "Can anything be done to keep it from spreading?" Florrie asked, twirling one braid around her finger. It was what she did when she was nervous. "Well, men will pour lime to try to clean the infection from the streets," Reverend Whitehead told us. "But as for the poison in the air that causes the cholera, there is little people can do except flee this polluted place. And now I must be off to visit other families," he added. "Take care of yourselves." He squared his shoulders and strode away like a soldier going into battle. "What do you think will happen now?" Florrie asked. "I don't know," I admitted. But then, right before our eyes, the street began to change. A woman ran past, a pillowcase stuffed with belongings bouncing against her back. A little boy trotted behind her, sobbing, trying to keep up. A man carrying a screaming toddler burst out of a nearby house and almost ran into us. Florrie and I jumped back out of his way. "I guess Reverend Whitehead was right," I said. "Families are leaving, and fast." "What about you, Eel?" "Me? I hadn't thought that far. I don't actually live on Broad Street anymore, but this is my neighborhood. My friends are here. Well, at least you are. I'm staying. Maybe I can help. Besides, I don't have anywhere else to go." A man came by and hung a yellow flag on a post on Berwick Street. "It's a warning for people to stay away," I realized. a warning that the great trouble was upon us all.